Started. Our presenter today, Brett Gunnell, is a member and co-chair of Sherman & Howard's Construction Industry Practice Group. He's an experienced trial attorney and is recognized widely as a top-tier construction lawyer in Colorado. Brett is a graduate-level instructor at the Construction Management Department of Colorado State University, and he has a technical background with a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and a master's degree in engineering management. He's also an experienced mediator and arbitrator of construction disputes, and we're pleased to have him speaking to us today. Brett, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jared. Good morning, everyone. To start this presentation, and really with any presentation that I give as a construction lawyer, it really is all about risk. Construction is just a risky business inherently, and the key is to recognize the various risks and position yourself to best manage them for project success. I'm going to talk about the risks today that involve GMP contracts. I'm going to attempt to address risks from various perspectives, from the owner's perspective, the contractor's perspective, perhaps the lender's perspective. But if I don't address something that you are interested in terms of risk from where you view things, just submit a question and I'll try to address it at the end. By way of a brief framework and background, let's talk a little bit about the delivery models for construction and the typical model that is involved with a GMP contract. At the outset of any project, an owner needs to decide on the type of delivery model and the form of the contract to use. The various options include what traditionally is the design, bid, build approach. There's various forms of construction management. There's design build, and more recently there's integrated project delivery. GMP contracts are common in design build and even more so in CMGC or CMAR contracts, as I have depicted here. That's a situation where a contractor gets involved early in the design as a construction manager in pre-construction, and then if they are involved in the project in construction, they put that job at risk. That's the CMAR, the construction management at risk. Let's talk about that delivery model particularly. It's got a unique feature in that the contractor is involved early in the design phase rather than first appearing on the scene at the start of construction, as traditionally was the case. These are typically negotiated contracts with an expectation, but certainly no promise of involvement of the contractor beyond the pre-construction phase. The conventional wisdom for CMAR contracts is that they are general contracting with a few pre-construction services thrown in. I think it goes a little bit deeper than that, at least with sophisticated parties. It certainly is typically viewed as maybe a little higher cost going in, but with an expectation of lower costs coming out. My own view is that contractor input during the design phase is invaluable, both to the owner and to the contractor. Owners get the benefit of value engineering. They get the benefit of a constructability analysis from the contractor who's familiar with how to build things versus just how to design things. They should get a more reliable construction budget because it is modified through the various phases of design, and pricing is essentially refined and becomes a little more definitive through time. The same goes with the schedule. The typical traditional approach of an engineer's estimate to inform the owner of construction costs, I think, is not as reliable as the contractor that's going to be building the job eventually. The owner is free to change the contractor going into construction, and that provides an opportunity for best value, even though they have been familiar with the contractor that was involved in pre-construction. From a contractor's perspective, the advantage is that they get to be behind the scenes a little bit as the drawings are being developed. They get to coordinate a better construction plan and provide input to that plan before the drawings are finalized. Contractors often will involve key subcontractors in the pre-construction services. And in theory, it gives them a leg up on competitors who may eventually be asked to provide pricing, competitive pricing for the construction phase. But if they have established a good relationship with the owner, that may move into construction without the involvement of any other contractors. So with that as the delivery model, let's turn to the next decision the owner has to typically make, which is the form of the construction contract. And the reason that that's important is because it is the contract that ultimately allocates and defines the risk of the project. It defines the respective rights and responsibilities of the parties and determines who's responsible for what activities. And it's important to invest the time to develop a good contract for each specific project. The cookie-cutter approach of pulling a form contract off the shelf and simply using it without customizing it, in my view, is just an invitation for disputes, and that's a little bit penny wise and pound foolish from a cost perspective. It's worth investing the money to make sure the contract matches what the expectations are of the project. And the most cost-effective approach is to assign the risk to the party best able to manage it, because as a construction lawyer, every dispute I see comes either from an unanticipated risk or a poorly managed risk. There are various kinds of form contracts. Different trade organizations produce form families of documents. I'm going to use the AIA form A102 and A201 documents at times during this presentation, not as an endorsement of those forms, but simply because they're very commonly used. Again, I think form contracts are a good starting point, but it's important to customize them and modify them because they do tend to address legal issues differently between them. So now let's talk about the GMP form of contract. What it means by definition is a guaranteed maximum price or a cap on the cost of construction. I think cynically a lot of parties believe at the end of a project what it really meant was generally more than planned. And that's because the GMP, even though it is a guaranteed maximum price, it's not unconditionally guaranteed. And there are certain ways the GMP can be adjusted during construction. Now, alternatives to a GMP contract, not that we're going to address them here, but those would be a fixed price or a stipulated sum contract, a unit price contract, or a pure cost plus contract without a cap. So the GMP provides a cap on a cost plus form of agreement. And ultimately, what gets paid and what the contract sum is comprised of is what is the cost of the work at the end of the day as defined in the contract and the contractor's fee. And I'm going to talk about the opt-in variety of GMP contracts in just a few minutes. When is the GMP established? Well, I mentioned that the key of a CMAR contract or a CMGC contract, key feature is the involvement of the contractor early in design. And so the GMP typically is established before the design is complete. If it's established at the time of design completion or 100% drawings, it effectively doesn't provide a lot of advantages over a traditional fixed price or stipulated sum contract. So GMP contracts are inevitably fast-track projects, meaning that the design and the construction phases overlap to some degree. The classic time to establish the GMP is in the DD stage, or the design development stage. That's the stage in the development of the design where the design intent is pretty well defined. It's a phase where the mechanical, electrical, plumbing, structural, architectural details are being depicted in full form drawings rather than schematic drawings. It is generally viewed as being the point in the design where the drawings are about 40 to 50% complete. There are kind of two areas in GMP contracts that I think raise the greatest risk. Or I guess said differently, there's two areas where all the risk in GMP contracts can be placed. And the first of those, the first category of where the risk arises in a GMP contract is in defining the basis of the GMP. And we're going to talk about that one first, and then the second area is defining what costs are reimbursable under the GMP. So talk about the basis of the GMP, the typical form contract. This is the AIA A102 document. That's the cost plus with a fee subject to a guaranteed maximum price. The typical language is found in Article 5, and it indicates that the contract sum, and that's the amount that can be paid to the contractor, is 1, the cost of the work, 2, the contractor's fee, and both of those collectively are subject to a cap called the guaranteed maximum price. A lot of people think that the terms contract sum and GMP are synonymous and interchangeable. That's only true if the GMP is reached and there are no savings in the contract. If you have a GMP of $10 million and you only incur costs of $8 million and there's a 10% fee, then the compensation of the contractor is $8.8 million. That's the contract sum, even though the GMP was $10 million. And then that difference or savings is handled according to how the contract treats it, and we'll talk about that a little later. In defining the GMP, both the owner and the contractor have a very significant role. The first two bullets on this slide are the owner's responsibility in terms of defining what can go into the GMP. And from an owner's perspective, the GMP is the project budget. It's going to be the cost of the construction portion of the overall project. And so it's important for the owner to carefully define the scope that's to be priced. And the more definition to the scope, the better and more reliable the pricing. And then also to develop through its engineer the specifications and the drawings and the related requirements to which the contractor and the subcontractors are going to be held. Now, the next three bullets are really the involvement or the contribution of the contractor to the GMP. In addition to providing just the GMP budget, which is the overall price that's going to serve as the cap, the contractor, or at least a prudent contractor, will identify clearly in writing for the owner all of the assumptions that the contractor made in reaching that GMP budget. And they will qualify that budget or the particular items of cost within that GMP budget as appropriate based on how they develop the number, and perhaps identify conditions that are required to make that budget hold. Now, I think sometimes contractors can criticize the owner's scope definition, and owners can criticize all the assumptions made by the contractor. But one aspect of a GMP project and contract is that it's designed to be transparent. It's designed to be open book. It's designed to be negotiated. And so when the owner takes seriously the role of carefully defining the scope and developing clear specification and drawing requirements, they contribute to overall project success. Similarly, when the contractor very carefully defines and is very transparent for the owner about the assumptions and the qualifications and the conditions on the price and communicates that very clearly, then that also will lead to less surprises and overall project success. And so the two key features, again, are transparency and communication. It's not always easy to write down clearly what is intended, but if the parties don't do a good job at that, a court, in the event of a dispute, will take over that role and tell the parties what they intended by reading the contract and perhaps viewing the conduct of the parties. So obviously, owners and contractors have a desire to control their own destiny, taking the time to carefully define the basis of the GMP up front so that there are no surprises after construction starts is fundamental to avoiding disputes and managing the risk. Now, I mentioned that the GMP can be adjusted during construction, and those are for things like changes in scope and things like reconciling allowance items, changes in the GMP assumptions. I mentioned that if a contractor defines the assumptions for the owner that are the basis of the cap on costs, and one of those assumptions is violated in the way the project proceeds, then the contractor typically will have a right to seek for an adjustment to the GMP. In other words, raising the cap on costs. And that goes back to that notion that the guarantee is really a guarantee subject to a couple of means of adjustments. And the other aspect of this is that it's not an unconditional guarantee. GMPs, or caps on costs, frequently grow rather than shrink over time. Cost reductions to the GMP are more common and probably easier to achieve during the design phase. But again, GMP does not necessarily mean an unconditional guarantee on costs. There are certain problem areas that, from a construction lawyer's perspective, as I have, that I see disputes arise. And I've identified 5 areas involved with GMP contracts that typically can explain the kinds of disputes that come up over a GMP contract. The first of those is when there are changes and delays beyond what the parties anticipated going in. And this is a situation where the contractor will claim entitlement to an increase in the GMP or the cap on costs due to changes and delays and other events. In other words, claim the right to recover additional reimbursable costs beyond what was originally defined as the cap because of some event or circumstances that has occurred during construction. The second bullet, sacrificing quality, is referring to a situation where the owner perceives that the contractor is quickly approaching the GMP in terms of its actual costs, and recognizing that once the GMP is exceeded, the contractor bears the risks of any costs. Owners frequently are concerned that, or may be concerned, that contractors are sacrificing quality in order to contain costs and protect the GMP. The third area of dispute is over scope creep, and that is where, again, since the GMP is originally developed with incomplete plans and specifications, this is a situation where the contractor claims an increased scope over the original bid assumptions or over the original basis of the GMP. Some undefined aspect of the work that, as it takes on definition, is different than what the contractor anticipated, and the claim is that the scope is increased. The fourth bullet, contractor waste, refers to a situation where the owner contends that savings would have existed under the GMP, but for the contractor's waste and how it performed the work. And essentially, this is a situation where the owner is saying effectively that the GMP didn't give me any advantages over a traditional fixed price contract because I end up paying the entire GMP just like I would have to pay the entire stipulated sum, and the whole point of a GMP contract is it's a cap. But ultimately, the owner is only obligated to pay cost incurred plus a fee. And if there's an expectation by the owner that the cost incurred plus a fee should come in under the GMP with savings to be returned, and that doesn't occur, there can be allegations of contractor waste. Sometimes those are framed in terms of contractor negligence in managing its subs and in other aspects of the work. Finally, the last one, and it's sort of an overlapping item, it's just an inherent tension or ambiguity or conflict or inconsistency in the requirements of the plans and specs and the underlying assumptions made by the contractor. Where an issue comes up and the owner says, look, it was defined as scope in the plans or in the specs, and the contractor claims that it was qualified or it was subject to an assumption, and maybe those two are in conflict, maybe those two are inconsistent, and there's a need in the event of competing language to reconcile those conflicts and inconsistencies. The second major category where problems occur in a GMP contract are after the GMP basis has been defined and you move into construction, and where the rubber meets the road, there are disputes over which costs are recoverable and which costs are not. Because again, a GMP contract ultimately allows recovery of cost of the work as defined plus a fee. And so this is a second major area of risk. And from a contractor's perspective, it's important to ensure that the cost of work definition in the contract, what's reimbursable or recoverable, includes each and every aspect of the GMP estimate or the components of that estimate, because if it doesn't, then even though there may be money within the GMP to pay for a cost, if it's not defined as reimbursable, the contractor can't recover it. And an example, I worked in the past on an out-of-state contract, and one of the largest components of cost in the contractor's GMP estimate, or a very large component, was the subsistence and the per diem that was going to be paid because the contractor was staffing this out-of-state project with individuals that were at the contractor's home office, and so they had travel costs, housing costs, and per diem costs built into the GMP budget, which was accepted by the owner. But the actual definition of cost in the contract excluded subsistence and out-of-town housing and those kinds of costs from recovery. Now, that wasn't a provision the owner put in because it was attempting to keep the contractor from recovering those costs. That was a provision in the standard boilerplate language of a form contract the parties started with. But again, if that's an aspect of cost the contractor intends to spend and knows they'll spend, and the contract doesn't allow them to recover that cost, then it may as well not have been in the GMP in the first place. The typical cost of work language in the A102 is all covered by Article 7. Article 7 of that contract defines what is reimbursable, and Article 8 defines what costs are not reimbursable. So you can see here I've reproduced the standard language from Article 7, and the key here is the language that generally describes what is going to be reimbursable before the contract goes on to go into specifics. And the key language here is it's costs necessarily incurred in the proper performance of the work. Those two words, necessarily and proper, are what in the typical contract define what is reimbursable. So an unnecessary cost or a cost that's incurred when a contractor is improperly performing, such as defective work, would not be considered reimbursable. The second important feature of this definition is in the last sentence, where the cost of the work shall include only the items set forth in Article 7. That's the opt-in nature of a GMP contract. In other words, if a cost is not defined as reimbursable, it's considered not reimbursable. And so you have to define the costs that are going to be paid, opt in those costs to the contract rather than the reverse. Now, this standard is often subject to a lot of negotiation during the contract phase, and obviously the parties have competing interests. While the owner would like to have costs limited to those necessarily incurred, contractors will frequently bargain for costs reasonably incurred. While the owner wants to insist on only costs that are incurred in the proper performance of the work, contractors will tend to favor a definition that allows for costs performed in the actual performance of the work. And then while an owner would like to have a contract that says unless the cost is defined as reimbursable, it is not, contractors would obviously prefer the alternative, which is that we're going to define those costs that are not reimbursable, or those categories of costs that are not reimbursable, and beyond that, if a cost is incurred in performing the actual work of construction, it's reimbursable. Again, all of this, whether you end up with language that uses necessarily or reasonably, or whether it's opt-in or opt-out, all of it is still subject to the GMP. It's just a matter of how the contract defines what costs are reimbursed up to the GMP. And the key here, again, as I mentioned with that subsistence example, is incurring a cost or even billing a cost does not make it reimbursable. In fact, even paying a cost does not make it reimbursable, because at the end of the day, GMP contracts are subject to an audit. And if during the audit a cost was incurred, billed, and paid that didn't meet the definition of cost in the contract, the contractor will be required potentially to disgorge that revenue as an improper recovery of cost. So obviously defining the cost of the work is essential. It's important, I think, for both parties to align the cost of work definition with the GMP budget, because that's what the expectation was going in. But those two are generated at different times and in different ways. Contractors are developing the GMP budget with feedback from the owner, and generally the cost of work definition starts from some organization like the AIA that provides a boilerplate definition of what's recoverable. And so aligning those two requires some customization. And reconciling and eliminating inconsistencies in how the GMP budget was developed and the assumptions under which it was developed and the cost of work definition in the contract requires some drafting precision and some clarity. And it's an area where paying money to a construction lawyer to help with that is money well spent. I think it's a general rule that the money spent earlier in a project on a lawyer is the best money you can spend. The later in the project you're hiring a lawyer, probably the worse it is for any party. Now, there are several categories of costs that tend to end up in dispute. I guess, or said better, if there is a dispute over cost items, it's generally limited to a couple of various things, and I'm going to try to give you a quick rundown of what those are. The first one's in terms of labor and equipment costs. In a typical CMGC contract, the contractor is actually self-performing very little work, typically, and so the major cost component for the contractor is the general conditions that they have for the project, the trailer, the supervision, those time-related costs that they incur to basically staff and run a job on a daily basis. And frankly, when owners are selecting or negotiating a GMP or a contractor for a GMP-type contract, they are typically evaluating contractors on a cost perspective based on only two things. One is the proposed general conditions, and two is the proposed fee. And that's how contractors, at least from a cost perspective, differentiate themselves in a negotiation for work with an owner on a CMGC contract. Now, the biggest issue in terms of labor and equipment costs is rates. And it's very typical. In fact, I think it's far more common than not that contractors and owners agree in advance on particular rates for categories of labor, project manager cost per hour, a project engineer or a field superintendent cost per hour. And they agree on those hourly rates in advance, and they may agree on rates for contractor-owned equipment in advance. The question in a cost-plus contract is, what is reimbursable? Because unless those rates are what is actually paid, if you audit pay records for the contractor, without altering or customizing the contract, there may be a conflict between the rates and between the actual cost. and where the contract calls for recovery of actual cost and there are scheduled rates. The dispute is whether the rates have been agreed to as a surrogate for actual cost or treated by definition as actual cost, or whether they're treated as merely a convenience for billing in the interim progress payments subject to an audit at the end of the day for actual costs. And this is a big issue, and it's I'm not going to suggest one versus the other than to say the parties should create some certainty in this area going into the contract so that it's well understood that that labor costs are going to be paid at rates, and those are not going to be audited after the fact because the rates are agreed to, or the alternative, that only actual costs are going to be paid and rates are going to be used just to make billing convenient. I think if owners have a concern over whether rates are appropriate or whether they have hidden fee or they don't represent actual costs, the time to evaluate that is pre-construction and get comfortable with what the rates are and what they're proposed to be in advance, and so rates can be used, because it certainly is easier to manage a project with agreed rates than it is based on true actual costs. The same goes for equipment, because it's difficult to know what the ownership cost of equipment is versus a rental invoice, and so agreeing on rates in advance simplifies that and avoids disputes over that down the road. Other disputed cost items are in terms of the general conditions. You know, they may be fixed or they may be estimated, but when and if the project is extended, and if it's extended for reasons that entitle the contractor to claim additional general conditions, what exactly is recoverable as cost is controlled by the contract. And so the options are, you can identify the cost down to every aspect of cost, including copies made at the job site and porta potties installed at the job site, or you can negotiate in advance on a rate, a daily rate for general conditions. And the issue that comes up there is that general conditions aren't constant throughout a project in reality. They usually start at one rate and then ramp up, and then in the middle of the project they're running at full rates, and then the general conditions or the staffing or the support needed to run a project goes down near the end of the job. And so if you agree in advance as parties on a daily general conditions rate to be paid in the event a job is extended, the question is that fair? Well, if you use an average, I guess if you believe in statistics, it's fair at the end of the day, because it's just as likely that you have something happening in the middle of the job where it is at full rate, and that would be an advantage to the owner, or at the end of the job, if a contractor is recovering full rate at a reduced level of general conditions, then clearly they are getting a benefit there. The alternatives are, in terms of pragmatics, is to schedule a general conditions rate perhaps by month over time and have that scheduled out just like cost, and understand what the contractor's plan is for the rate of general conditions, and then fix that rate as a compensable item in the event it comes up. Insurance, another one that is an issue, because frequently contractors are using subcontractor default insurance, and those programs, what is the true cost of that versus the rate that's charged, can be a subject of some debate, and so parties are well advised to agree on how that's going to be reimbursed in advance, because that's a cost that fluctuates with the overall cost of the project and likely goes up when costs on the project go up. Other categories that I want to address specifically are these 5 or 6 bullets that I have here, and I want to spend a minute to talk about each one of these cost categories, because they are areas that I think deserve very special attention, and it's important to determine and pay attention to how or even whether these are defined in the contract as reimbursable. The first one is correction of defective work. And in the form agreement, this particular provision or this category of cost is defined as reimbursable, but only if, and that's the important part. Again, this is an opt-in form of contract, so A102. So if you read the language, then cost of repairing or correcting damaged or non-conforming work is reimbursable to the contractor only if, number one, it's not due to negligence and it's not due to some failure to perform as required by the contractor or its subs. And number two, only after other alternative sources of recovery are exhausted, such as if a subcontractor was responsible for the defective work, the subcontractor should bear the cost of repairing it without any additional reimbursement from the owner to the contractor, and similarly if there's insurance that covers that. The policy issue that comes up on correction of defective work is the contractor view goes something like this, that contractors are willing, in the interests of giving an owner the best price for a project, willing to take on less than top shelf subcontractors. But they do that with the expectation, or at least the understanding, that that lower price that they can get from less than a top shelf subcontractor comes with a risk of rework, and that's a focus or a purpose of the contingency that we'll talk about later. And so if work is done improperly and it has to be repaired from a contractor's point of view, that may still be cheaper at the end of the day than had an original top shelf subcontractor been used that would be able to bear the cost of the repair itself, or wouldn't perform the defective work in the first place. Obviously, from an owner's perspective, there's concern about paying for necessary costs in the proper performance of the work, and paying work twice seems to run afoul of that definition of cost. Now again, this and the other issues I'm going to talk about to follow are not issues with the GMP. All of these are subject to the GMP. So even if correction of defective work is defined as reimbursable, it's still subject to the cap. The next one is the contractor contingency. Now importantly, this is very typical in GMP pricing because they're done on less than complete drawings. So there has to be a contingency. Typical contingency ranges from 3 to 8% depending on the level of completion of the drawings at the time of pricing. But very importantly, contingency is hardly ever addressed in traditional form contracts. It's not addressed at all in the AIA documents, for example. And so having an understanding in advance of how contingency will be treated requires custom drafting, and there's a lot of issues that you have to consider along that line. And I've listed some of them here. The kinds of things you need to think about in terms of contingency is, what's the purpose and what's going to be allowed to be billed against the contingency account? And what are the sources of contingency? You may have an original source that's a line item in the GMP budget that just says bottom line contingency, 5% of overall costs. But you may also have, for example, buyout savings that occur when you go out and get subcontractor pricing, less than what you had in the GMP budget. That delta that's generated is a potential source of additional contingency because it is money that is available beyond what is planned for to be spent because the cost came in buyout less than what was budgeted. So whether those costs or that excess rolls into contingency can be addressed contractually. Who controls contingency? Are there reporting requirements from the contractor to the owner on how it's being spent? And is there a right to audit the contingency account? And in terms of the contingency, I think this is an issue that uniquely creates interest on the part of the contractor, the owner, and even lenders because it's an aspect of the overall budget that is undefined at the start, and it's just essentially a slush number. That's not meant as a pejorative term, but it's a slush fund beyond what's categorically defined, and then there needs to be definition added to the contract on how it will be treated. The next category of concern that should be carefully viewed in a GMP contract and the language of the contract are allowances. These are essentially plug numbers in the GMP estimate for a particular scope of work. Maybe light fixtures haven't been determined, and it's not clear whether they're going to be a simple light fixture or a fancy chandelier. And so the cost of that component of work may change over time. And so if it's treated as an allowance, the contractor puts in a plug number into the estimate, and then the ultimate recovery of cost for that allowance item is whatever it really cost. So if a plug number was $10,000 and it actually costs $20,000, the GMP grows by $20,000, and that has to be paid by change order. If the original plug number was $10,000 and the owner only spends $5,000 for light fixtures, the GMP shrinks by $5,000, and that has to be paid by deductive change order. Now, I tell clients, whether they're owners or contractors or lenders, that you should consider and understand that what an allowance is an elastic component of the GMP. This is an area that is going to move the GMP up or down based on actual cost. So this is a true cost plus component of the GMP. It's not subject to the cap, even though it's within the cap, because it will shrink or grow to what it actually costs. So it's important to understand how it's defined. Typically, in form contracts, allowances are material cost only, but that may be insufficient from a contractor's point of view. It may cost more to install various kinds of light fixtures, to use that example. But it can also be structured to cover other aspects of the work, like winter protection, which can be a cost that is unknown, and if it's structured as an allowance, essentially the owner takes the risk of winter protection because actual costs of the allowance at the end of the day will define what has to be paid by change order. So again, allowances are GMP busters, and it's important to understand how they're defined, how they're treated, and what's subject to an allowance. I talked earlier about the difference between the contract sum and the GMP. That difference is called savings in a GMP contract. The purpose of a GMP contract or of the savings is to return money to the owner if the cost plus the fee is less than the overall GMP. And, essentially the contractor has an incentive to come into their budget with or without a share of the savings for relationship purposes and for simply, reputation purposes. The owner has an incentive, obviously, to see costs come in under budget and be able to recapture some of the savings and reinvest it in the project how they see fit. And it's important to know, though, how are the savings treated? I think the form agreements don't do a very good job of defining how savings are going to be calculated and treated, other than to say they're the difference between the GMP and the contract sum at the end of the day. But is that the original GMP? Is that the GMP after it's been adjusted with approved change orders? Is contingency a part of the shared savings, or is it not? None of that's addressed in form agreements. And when do you reconcile the savings? Do you reconcile it at the time of final payment? Because if you do, there may be subsequent costs that are incurred by the contractor, and from a contractor's perspective, if there's still money left in the GMP and they're still incurring costs, they have a reasonable expectation to recover those costs up to the GMP. And so one way to address that is to build a warranty reserve into the GMP and a method for paying that warranty reserve out over time or at a certain point in time. But there's a lot of issues on shared savings that are left unaddressed in the form agreements and that can result in disputes down the road if they aren't carefully looked at. Self-performed work is another aspect that's not addressed typically in form agreements. What the AIA document does do is it defines and puts controls on what are called related party transactions, and that's to make sure that the contractor is dealing at arm's length with subcontractors rather than dealing with family members or others without disclosing that relationship. But interestingly, the definition of a related party in the typical contract is parent, subsidiary, affiliate, or other entity having common ownership or management with the contractor. In other words, it doesn't relate at all to self-performed work, where the contractor is itself performing as a subcontractor and defining a scope of work, say concrete, to be a fixed price aspect of self-performed work and say that they're essentially working as a subcontractor for that particular scope. And that can happen. You can have self-performed work, and it's important to address contractually how that's going to be managed. What are the controls on that work? Are there agreed markups for overhead and profit? Are there agreed controls on general conditions for self-performed work? Is there a requirement that before a contractor can be allowed to self-perform, they have to establish through comparable third-party bids that they are competitive in the pricing? And then ultimately, is there specific contract authorization to do that kind of work, or prohibition on that kind of work without authority? All of that is sort of not addressed in form agreements and needs to be built into the contract if disputes are to be avoided. The final category in this section is price escalation. And in a typical form contract, it's not addressed. It doesn't say which party bears the risk of escalating prices from what was originally assumed in the GMP pricing, which may have been well before the start of construction or the time of actual buyout, where that pricing becomes important. And in a default position, the contractor bears the risk of escalation because the contractor bears the risk of performing the scope of work for what it agreed to be the GMP. But there are questions. Let's say that steel prices go up over what was estimated in the GMP. And even if the contractor bears that risk, is that a contingency cost? Is that an allowable cost? Is escalation an allowable charge against the contingency as an unanticipated cost? Or is it defined to be sort of assumed within the base scope of the steel pricing? Is it a change? Can you submit a change order for escalation? That would only be the case if there is an escalation provision built into the contract. And again, there may be escalation provisions in the prime contract or in subcontracts, but this is an area that I think often gets ignored and can jeopardize the GMP and turn it into what is not a guarantee, but again, turns out to be different than the parties expected because it was a risk that wasn't dealt with. A couple of final wrap-up items of discussion here on GMP contracts are just a few other reimbursement issues I want to address. And one is on the contractor's fee. Now, this can be specified as a fixed fee. It can be specified as a percent of the construction costs, and it can also be calculated on less than all of the construction costs. Owners frequently contend that it needs to exclude what I call below-the-line items. And so there's the hard cost of the work, the physical work that's being performed, but there's also stuff like insurance and overhead and bond premiums and other costs below the line. And if those are reimbursable and fee is calculated as a percentage of cost, then the fee is calculated on those items. And that may or may not be what's intended, but parties need to consider those issues and make sure they have some clarity in the way the contract's drafted. Fee is different than profit. Profit is revenue minus cost for a contractor. The fee is the amount they recover based on how the contractor defines the fee. So if a job overruns the GMP on cost, the contractor first surrenders its fee to cover the cost and then potentially goes out of pocket at no fee to cover its costs. Also an issue that's not particularly common are GMP subcontracts. Subcontracts typically are let and are agreed to on a fixed price basis, and the form agreements usually specify that if there is to be a GMP contract, there's a lot of controls and notice and listing requirements before a contractor can enter into a GMP subcontract. But in the event of a GMP subcontract, the contract should define what's reimbursable, what the notice requirements are, the approval requirements, and so forth. And whether or not the same cost of work definition in the prime contract flows down to the subcontract. Finally, there are various fixed price arrangements within the GMP contract. And remember, I mentioned at the outset that the GMP contract is a form of a cost-plus type agreement. And so having fixed-price portions within a cost-plus agreement is a little bit of a misnomer and inconsistent, perhaps, but it's real. So it's important to recognize those aspects of the GMP contract which themselves operate like a stipulated sum agreement. And that's labor and equipment charging rates that are agreed to as a surrogate for costs, burden rates the same, and then lump sum change orders that are negotiated. Finally, and the last issue is, and the form contracts don't do a good job of this, is defining what the audit rights are and the audit procedures are for a GMP contract, because it is ultimately subject to an audit to make sure that the costs that are paid are the same as what the contract allows to be recovered. And I've just identified some things here of concern that I think need to be addressed and thought of contractually at the outset in order to minimize disputes over audits down the road. The first is the scope of the audit. For example, if you agree on labor rates, are those subject to an audit? They probably not, other than to make sure that the hours that are charged at those rates are supported. The timing of the audit, when does it occur? At substantial completion, at final completion? Can it occur for 90 days after completion of the project? Can it go on can it be done a year later? And then who pays for the audit? And if the audit discloses costs that were billed improperly under the contract, are those costs shifted back to the contractor? The selection of the auditor, and contractors have a key interest in making sure an auditor that's selected is independent and is going to view costs fairly, and so having a role in the selection process, perhaps a veto right over an initial auditor selection, is often considered. And finally, confidentiality of the audit, because auditors receive information that contractors will consider to be proprietary in the course of an audit, and contractors may not wish that to be disclosed. With that, we'll take questions. And Jared's handed me a couple of questions that have been submitted here. The first one asks, can it be effective for contingencies to be jointly controlled by owners and contractor, and what controls need to be in place beforehand? I think that's a really good question, and it's something that does need to be thought through in advance. At a minimum, I think owners have an interest in regular reporting of the contingency and an accounting of what's being spent in the contingency fund. And if you think about the way that owners and lenders look at construction costs, they're usually viewing it from a schedule of values, so it has items of work that are listed by scope. And when the contingency is spent, and whether it's approved, needs to be approved or not, once it's spent, those monies, for clarity, should be reallocated from the contingency account to the scope account. So if, for example, there's a bust in the electrical and the contractor has billed that out as 100%, the purpose of the contingency is if there's additional electrical costs, those monies get transferred from the contingency account to the electrical line item and can be billed there, because there's, the contract, a GMP contract is not typically a line item GMP contract, it's just a bottom line GMP contract. So, but owner control on those contingencies, I think is perfectly acceptable, and what's important is to define what's in and what's out. As a general rule, owners have their own owner contingency that pays for development costs and other marketing and other project-related costs, and potentially to pay for scope adds and enhancements to the project that they wish to consider down the line. The contractor's contingency in the GMP should not be a fund to pay for owners' scope adds. And but for example, one way to effectively manage a GMP for the benefit of both parties I've seen is to allow an owner to, at certain points when the project has advanced and the risk of a cost overrun is diminishing, that there can be a look at the contingency account and an opportunity for the owner to maybe in one sense prepay for scope items through contingency and refund them later, or alternatively agree to simply use contingency for scope. But as I said in the outset, just defining what the controls are, who manages it, who gets to make the decision, is it an owner right subject, with approval not to be unreasonably withheld, or is it simply a discretionary spend by the contractor? Those are all decisions that need to be made in advance. I hope that answers it. It's a range of options. I think different parties have different interests, and you should consult, with a good construction attorney in this aspect to know how to make the contract read the way that your intentions are. Second question is, if a project with a GMP contract is in trouble, what should you do to avoid a claim over cost and prepare to bring or defend claims? That's a little more of a question than I can take on in the 2 minutes that I have left here. It's a great question, and it's exactly where you should be focused, because if you get anything as a takeaway from this presentation, I'm hoping that it is there are things that you can do early in a project that will reduce or mitigate the risk that you're going to have disputes about the project or the contract down the road. And that money's the best spent money. Now, if you get in a situation where the project is out of, over budget and out of control, all those concerns that I talked about earlier about, is the contractor sacrificing quality? Are there other issues that are going on that are unexpected? All those things need to be looked at. It's a little more than I can take on right now, and preparing to bring and defend claims is a great topic for another webinar, and we'll make a note of that. I think that's all the time we have for questions.
That is, Brett. Thank you for your presentation today and for taking questions. And thank everyone for joining us this morning. If you submitted questions that we didn't have time to address, please feel free to submit them by email or give Brett a call at the contact information you see on your screen now. Again, we appreciate you attending and hope you all have a great day. Thank you.